Hello everyone, welcome to yet another day in this clown decade, the decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better. And today we are going to be going through Reform's Robin Hood policy, which is the idea to stop non-doms fleeing the UK. But as usual with absolutely anything we do in the UK, anything that benefits the rich is not a vote winner, and so you effectively have to bribe the country into effectively voting for what's good for it. And that doesn't always give you the best economic outcomes ever, but at the end of the day, if we want a country that functions, that's simply what you have to do when you have universal suffrage. So Farage will announce a radical Robin Hood style tax policy that will offer non-doms a chance to pay a £250,000 or £250,000 fee to shield them from tax, with the proceeds going directly to the lowest paid. Which is quite a funny way to do redistribution of wealth, because it's actually just the most direct I think I've ever seen in my life, and usually one that I am instinctively against. However, as I preambled this entire video with, to get the left on board, sometimes you have to do stupid things, and I'm not being funny, the cheapest option is usually the best for that. And also, it's very much worth pointing out here for those of you that might not understand this, which I understand it's all very complicated. But when it says shielded from tax, it doesn't mean all tax in the UK. It just means taxes that the UK could apply to, say, their foreign assets, but will not if they obviously pay this £250,000. It's absolutely reasonable and very, very normal for countries to not double dip on tax like this. So say if you have assets in Germany or France, the United Kingdom, and this is how it worked for literally 200 years by the way, would not tax your foreign assets as long as you were obviously planning on going back and only here temporarily. That is the whole point. Why this became such an issue is because Rishi Sunak's wife was benefiting from the non-dom status, despite the fact her husband was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, her kids were enrolled long-term in British schools, and therefore probably wasn't the type of person who could end up being a non-dom. And so the Tories knee-jerk reacted to it, completely changed the rules. You had a bit of an exodus of millionaires. Labour come in, make the whole tax system worse and tighten those rules even more, and there's a bigger exodus of wealth. This, obviously, along with many other policies, is supposed to reverse that. Under the new reform policy, non-doms, UK residents whose permanent home is abroad, would not be taxed on any wealth, income or capital gains earned overseas. They would also avoid paying inheritance tax, again, only on foreign assets and income overseas, under the plans which are set out in a policy document seen by the Times. Again, this is how it all worked for 200 years, and recent changes by the Tories as a knee-jerk reaction have made everything worse. Non-doms will be handed a new Britannia Card and qualify for the tax exemptions by paying a £250,000 one-off landing fee, and it can be renewed every 10 years at no extra cost, which is basically then turning it into about £25,000 a year, which is only about £5,000 less than we saw under the Tory regime before they had their post-knee-jerk reforms. But the interesting part comes here. Reform said that 100% of the revenue raised will be transferred by HM Revenue and Customs directly into the bank accounts of the lowest earning 10% of full-time workers. It will be tax-free and transferred within 90 days at the end of each tax year, and likely to be dubbed Reform's Robin Hood tax for redistributing money from the rich to the poor. Which again, instinctively when I first saw this, I thought, oh, that doesn't sound great, I don't particularly like redistribution. How exactly does it actually incentivise people into work? This sounds like even more reason to stick on minimum wage, but, well, you go into a bit of detail. This would affect 2.5 million workers earning a full-time salary of less than £23,000 and will be given £600 if 6,000 non-doms paid for the Britannia Card. So this is the important point. What Reform have actually, in quite a novel way, done is incentivised working people on minimum wage work, typically those that, let's face it, between the ages of 16 and 30, a lot of them actually will probably be post-university graduates who are effectively struggling to find a better job. And typically these are the type of people that just hate billionaires because it's all they've grown up to know. But now you've effectively incentivised them to want more billionaires in the country, because that directly affects the amount they'll get per year. And £600 per minimum wage worker, that's what, about 2%? Just over 2% of their annual earnings? That feels like a lot to them, but realistically £600 is not going to stop you from wanting to get a raise or a promotion that on average would see 10 to 20% increase in your salary. So while I completely understand and agree with all the arguments as we'll go through about wage compression and things like that, which as far as I can tell are the main legitimate concerns about this policy, and I'm going to go through an awful lot of criticism of this policy, then I think frankly we're looking in the wrong place. You can help fix those problems in other ways with other policy. This one I don't think is going to largely affect the wage compression issue so much. But at the same time, £600 would be very welcome to, well, pretty much everyone on minimum wage work. I know I would have very much liked it. Britannia Card holders would still be charged tax on a remittance basis, meaning they would be taxed in the normal way on any UK-sourced income and gains. Yeah, so this is just how the non-dom status worked for 2 centuries. Reform said the policy was designed to reverse the exodus of wealthy individuals following increasingly erroneous rules placed on non-doms. Yep, totally fine, totally agree. I've been complaining about that for, well, about 2 years now. So I am glad to see Reform doing something about it. They do redistribution stuff, which I don't like, but at the same time, I have been defending righty politicians throwing red meat out to lefties for some time now. If I did it with Liz Truss, which is literally the biggest redistribution of wealth ever, I'm obviously going to do it for this, which is doing it at a much lower extent. You know, we're talking about £1.5 billion being redistributed directly from wealthy foreign individuals, by the way. If you're going to do redistribution, I think the least offensive way to do it to me is this way, by directly taking it from foreign wealthy individuals and giving it to actual full-time working people who are British nationals. Another issue I saw with this that I do think is a legitimate one is, well, effectively, isn't it foreign ethnics who have become British nationals who make up quite a lot of the lower income? To which I'd say, yeah, probably. I think the thing is, though, is that they've specifically said it's full-time workers, and I don't think we particularly have the statistics for that. At least I can't find them offhand, so it would be interesting to see who gets most of this. And yes, obviously I think recent British nationals are the ones that should not be getting this, but, well, at the same time, the gains you will get from getting foreign wealth back into the UK is a rather good way to make the whole thing work. I know it's a bit of a meme to say we've always had migrants here and what have you, but Britain quite literally has always had wealthy foreigners. Hence, proof in the pudding, we had the non-dom status since like 1799 or something like that. Anyway, I'll move on to criticisms. One that was taken rather seriously because of who wrote this article, but you go into details, there's an awful lot wrong with it. So Dan Neidle, who is a UK tax expert, to be fair to him, and has been advising every political party pretty much on their tax policy, and also, it needs to be said, is a Labour Party member and activist, and is actually involved at the top of the Labour Party, as he is a member of the National Constitutional Committee of the Labour Party, so I'm throwing all this out to let you know that there is a chance that this could be quite biased, but also it needs to be pointed out, I'm afraid. The man has advised on the current tax regime we currently find ourselves in. He even advised the SNP on their tax policy, and it's tax policy that basically everybody hates. Which is all very strange because he was talking about tax policy with the Institute of Economic Affairs yesterday, basically complaining about the whole thing. Which is a funny thing to hear because all I can think to say is, but hang on, this whole operation was your idea. But anyway, we'll see what he has to say about this Britannia Card system, and the title already is Inspiring Confidence. The £34 billion cost of Reform UK's Britannia Card proposal. So according to Dan and the Tax Policy Associates, there are 3 major problems with this. First, it would discourage highly skilled professionals from moving here as they can't afford the £250,000. Well, don't pay it, just pay the tax then. For the first time in the UK's history, an expat arriving here would be immediately subject to full UK tax and likely also tax in their home country. That's a big tax increase. The Reform UK proposal would make the UK uncompetitive. Well, again, the Tories introduced a £30,000 a year fee you had to pay on top of all this to get the non-dom status. So forgive me for not taking this concern particularly seriously. And also on top of that, if you have foreign assets they can't afford to then cover with the tax system, I mean, assuming it's, say, an ISA or something like that, it's not that difficult to move that money into a UK-based ISA, which again will be tax-free. Okay, it's limited to £20,000 per year, but that's still probably going to be a good chunk of savings from highly skilled professionals who don't really put an awful lot of money into their assets, unless it's, say, a house. which again, you can sell and move. So I don't particularly take that first one particularly seriously, for two reasons, as I say. One, this isn't too different to how things used to work anyway. Again, 250,000 up front rather than £30,000 a year. That's still quite an unaffordable price tag for this protection, and we still got skilled workers. And two, as I say, if they do have assets, especially if they're low cost compared to, say, entrepreneurs, then they're relatively liquid and you're going to be able to move them to the UK anyway. It's a big tax increase. The Reform UK proposal will make the UK uncompetitive. Well, it didn't in the past, so I don't see why this necessarily would. Second, all the recent changes to the non-dom regime mean that any government would struggle to persuade the very wealthy that the Britannia Card would really provide a lifelong exemption, so take-up would be very limited. It was claimed that they had an advanced copy of this 12-page proposal, and they are making very basic mistakes on how the policy works. It's not a lifelong exemption, it's 10 years. How are you getting basic stuff like that wrong if you had an advanced copy? But I suppose there is a decent point here. Even with 10 years, you have to effectively pray that reform stick around, because I don't think any other... Well, especially if they're taking advice off this guy, no other party is going to be keeping this policy in place. So there is a point there of, oh, well, how are billionaires supposed to trust that they're actually going to get bang for their buck if in 5 years, say, reform aren't actually in power anymore? Well, I suppose my response to that is keep voting reform then. And finally, apparently most seriously, the card will provide a very large and expensive tax windfall to a small number of very wealthy people who are already here. The OBR data, this is from the OBR, shows that this would amount to 34 billion of lost government revenue over 5 years. That would have to be funded either by a tax increase or spending cut. Well, make spending cuts then, I don't care. But years ago when Michael Gove was saying, oh, people are getting fed up with the experts getting it wrong, the OBR is the perfect example of an institution that's supposedly full of experts that keep getting it wrong. Just on face value, you should not be taking that £34 billion seriously. Anyway, another funny part of this report is that in 2024, during a timeline of how the non-dom states have changed, the Tory party announced they'd scrap the non-dom regime and introduced a modern exemption system, the Foreign Income and Gains or FIG regime. The concept of domicile will be completely abolished and replaced with a simple count of years resident in the UK. New UK residents will be entirely exempt from a tax for 4 years and then subject to income and capital gains in the usual way. Inheritance tax would apply after 10 years. Again, I'm assuming that's on foreign assets. Property settled into excluded property trust before April 2025 would remain untaxed, but after that trust would cease to shield property from tax. Labour enacted this regime, but with the one significant change: the benefit of excluded property trust would disappear completely, the historic and future ones. All of this has caused a significant number of very wealthy non-doms to leave the UK. The figures that have been reported are not reliable, but it's clear from numerous discussions I've had with private wealth banking and legal contacts that the effect is real. So, again, Dan has advised on tax policy for the Tories and, of course, for Labour. It does not shock me that he will probably have a hand in this, and here he is effectively having to defend this system that has, yes, helped wealth disappear from the UK. He played his own hand in it, and it's kind of no surprise that he's trying to defend the regime that he has helped create. Labour may be about to row back on some of the reforms, but by softening the most difficult part of the package for many non-doms, inheritance tax fully applying after 10 years, my suggestion would be, after 10 years, gently phase in inheritance tax so that it initially applies at 4%, then goes up 4% every year until it reaches 40%. Fine. Anyway, moving on to details of the problem. So whilst the proposal makes the UK more attractive to the very wealthy, in terms of £250,000 for 10 years of not taxing their foreign assets, again, totally normal and historically that has been the norm, it makes the UK much less attractive to the highly skilled and highly paid professionals we want to attract to the UK, e.g. doctors, coders, scientists and entrepreneurs. Okay, entrepreneurs I can understand, they obviously would have foreign assets, but in terms of scientists, coders and doctors, okay, sure, they'll have savings account in ISAs, but again, these are relatively easy to move around. Again, they might have property, not quite as liquid, however, once again, it's not unusual to be in a chain and move to property in the United Kingdom, depending how long they wanted to stay here for, etc. Anyway, the effect of Conservative and Labour reforms is that these new arrivals will be exempt from tax on foreign income for 4 years without paying anything. That's attractive because high earners will often have asset savings back home, and having these savings taxed in the UK is unattractive. Again, depending what these assets are, they can be relatively easy to move, and if they're hard to move, okay, unlucky for them, I guess, unlucky with the double dipping on taxes. Because, okay, it can make us look unattractive to these high-skilled workers compared to places like Ireland, Denmark, France, Belgium and the Netherlands. However, as I mention in almost every video, I know plenty of high-skilled workers who have moved away from the UK and won't be affected by this because they're British nationals. Also, on top of all of this, yet again, everyone constantly says Gary Stevenson's wrong because he keeps saying, oh, assets aren't mobile, you can just tax wealth like this. Even Dan Neidle has done, a podcast with the IEA explaining that that's actually just total nonsense. And yet here he is saying, oh, these wealthy people actually have assets that aren't mobile. But hang on, you said a wealth tax can't work because wealth is incredibly mobile. So even based on his own arguments that he makes, I can't see how it makes too much sense. And to be honest with you, when I questioned Dan himself on this on Twitter, the first thing he brought up was ISAs. But as far as I'm aware, I mean, I have an ISA myself, it's not particularly difficult to actually move that money about. In fact, I've experienced moving that money about because I took it out of the ISA to put it into the house. I don't see what the issue would be taking out a French ISA and putting it in a British one if you don't want to get taxed on it but can't afford the £250,000. If Britain offers you a very good wage for your high skills, you're obviously going to make it work somehow. There might be issues here, but I don't think it's as big as Dan is saying is my point. Anyway, the big issue that's the one I really want to go through is the large windfall gain for few people, which will allegedly cost £34 billion. So the proposal will give a windfall gain to a relatively small number of very wealthy people who are planning to stay here and pay UK tax, but will now pay £250,000 fee instead. That tax that now won't be received, and so there will be no wider economic benefit because these people are already going to be here. Again, because it's so confusingly written, I'm just going to be charitable and assume when he says pay UK tax, I'm assuming he means paying the double dip tax on their foreign assets. Anyway, the amount involved is very large. The OBR... Assessments of the recent Conservative and Labour non-dom reforms say they raise a net $33.9 billion from 2026 to 2030, most of which is from the Tory reforms, which even though he stated above the Labour reforms too, this all needs a bit of tweaking, especially with inheritance tax. The $34 billion reflects a raise from a small number of very wealthy people who would opt to buy a Britannia Card and so pay no tax, and therefore revenue immediately lost by Reform UK's proposal. So I can't find the 33.9 figure directly in the OBR statistics. However, from what I can gather, he has managed to get £33.9 billion in total revenue, looking at the combined March and October 2024 costing and forecasting it beyond there when it comes to the post-behavioural costing. 9.5 plus 13.1 plus 6.8 plus 4.5 adds up to 33.9 billion. For some reason, though, he doesn't take the 0.1 in lost revenue from 2025 to 2026 off, but whatever, I don't really care. I want to point out what the funniest part of this whole costing forecast is. Literally in the final costings section that is directly above this table, by the way. Paragraph 122 says, this policy costing was assigned a very high uncertainty rating in both March and October 2024. There is significant uncertainty around the size of the tax base and the behavioural response to this measure. In other words, taking the post-behavioural costing has a very high uncertainty, and yet we are in the middle of 2025 and we know it's pretty much worst case scenario, with 10% of foreign wealth leaving the country. It was more than was projected, by the way, and yet that is being used as an excuse to throw down this reform policy, which, yeah, probably does need tweaking. I'm not going to lie about that, and I don't particularly like the idea of redistribution, but if it wins votes for relatively cheap, so be it. And it's fully costed, by the way. But there is significant uncertainty around the size of the tax base and behavioural response to this measure, which is contingent on decisions made by a relatively small number of wealthy individuals. If that is not a signal to say, do not trust these numbers, I don't know what is. Can we just make it clear? We have a tax expert who is a Labour Party activist and advises all the parties on their tax policy, and the tax policy in the UK is just infamously one of the worst in the world, is now trying to attack an economic policy that is going against this orthodoxy, and his main point is by using numbers that the infamously poor statisticians at the OBR have themselves said, oh, these numbers, by the way, are highly uncertain. I could not give you an example of someone who has done work they have been ordered to do in statistics to then basically say in the conclusion, yeah, you basically shouldn't use these numbers. So as an alternative, I think I'm going to use a much more reliable forecaster. So the Centre for Economics and Business Research published on the 6th of May, so a much more recent estimate, the impact of changes to the UK non-dom regime. And let's just skip to their estimates, which as far as I'm concerned are much more reliable for two reasons. One, they don't say it's massively uncertain. Two, it's not by the OBR, who are infamously terrible. So first things first, these much more reliable estimates say that if 25% of the non-dom remittance basis taxpayers leave the UK due to the reforms in the foreign income and gains regime, the net gain to the Treasury will be zero. In other words, you lose a quarter of them, there is absolutely no effect and no positive or negative impact on tax remittance. However, losing 25% of your wealthy non-doms, yeah, that's obviously going to affect your GDP quite negatively. By the way, at this point, I believe we are at about 10% of them leaving. That number's only going up. I believe the current Treasury estimate is about 20%, but knowing how public sectors work with these estimates and how much they use the OBR, I can only imagine that that is an underestimation, but we'll have to wait and see. Other sources exploring the potential behaviour responses to this policy change suggest that the emigration rate could be far higher. For instance, a study from Oxford Economics shows that about 60% of tax advisors expect more than 40% of the non-dom clients to leave within 2 years of the policy change. That's way above the 25%, isn't it? However, that is for one particular company with their clients, so whether that's going to apply to everyone, it's hard to say. So under higher emigration rates, which they're talking about because they're largely expecting it, our modelling suggests that the Treasury would begin to make a loss in scenarios where 33%, 40% and 50% of non-dom taxpayers leave the UK. The net loss to the Treasury scheme would be 0.7 billion, 1.4 billion and 2.4 billion respectively. Over the course of the current Parliament, these losses amount to 3.5 billion, 7.1 billion and 12.2 billion respectively under these scenarios. Dan has been defending this regime, by the way. Without accounting for the emigration effect, that is, if none of the previously non-dom people were to leave, we estimate the reforms will produce a static yield of about 2.5 billion in the first year if they came into effect, rising to 3 billion in 2029 to 30, compared to the OBR, which estimated 10.3 billion and 8.9 billion respectively, which is a 5 to 8 billion pound per year lower yield. Average that out to say 6.5 billion, multiply that by the 4 years that Dan was talking about, you are looking at an actual loss, assuming no emigration by the way, of about 8 billion. However, it's absolutely pointless looking at that because we know there's been emigration, and while in the other report Dan was trying to say, oh, the numbers are overblown, clearly the tax revenue isn't saying so, but we'll go into that in just a second. Our analysis suggests that preventing large-scale emigration, such as through tweaking the recently implemented scheme, providing incentives, or otherwise limiting behavioural responses, will help soften any fiscal blow. Well, obviously. Non-domiciled taxpayers already pay substantially more income tax than the median UK employee. The average non-dom taxpayer pays 21 times the median income earner in income tax. 85,000 versus 4,000. Those liable for remittance-based charge pay even more tax, with an average income tax bill as 78 times that of the median income earner. And 10% of that is just gone. Like, that's literally what's happened. We have lost a whole bunch of income tax that isn't even being acknowledged here. These second-order effects are just not acknowledged by Dan, which again is another reason that, frankly, his findings should be laughed at. Imagine, he is ignoring second-order effects as a tax researcher for some reason, and on top of that, if he is looking at second-order effects of people emigrating and the tax intake as a result of people not even emigrating, with numbers that have been directly said to be terrible by the OBR, yeah, this is some research that should absolutely be laughed at. It's not full of pointless criticism, by the way. The worry about highly skilled workers being put off by it, okay, that's probably something that should be looked at, fine. But when your main point is using terrible numbers and not even taking into account people leaving the country, yeah, pretty terrible statistics. The average non-dom taxpayer contributes around 13 times the median income earner in national insurance contributions, with remittance basis charge payers paying more than 30 times. This group also accounts for 1.4% of all capital gains tax receipts from individuals, despite representing at most 0.6% of capital gains tax taxpayers. In other words, non-doms are so economically useful and input so much more than anyone else in the UK. It is ridiculous to have any sort of regime that puts them off coming here. You look at second and third order effects, and even if you take the stupid 34 billion pound black hole this would apparently make at face value, from the looks of it, it's just filled in overnight just by these effects of capital gains tax and income tax. Mental that this is the route he decided to go down and was most important. As of the 22 to 23 income tax receipts from non-dom individuals, they are broadly the same as 2007 to 8, despite the decline of the non-dom population. Well, that's because income tax increased. In the tax year 2007 to 8, the Treasury received £6.3 billion in income tax receipts from 137,000 non-dom payers, and despite the fact that that's been halved, they only lost about 100 million on the basis of about 74,000. I mean, just to put that into clear terms, what that means is, despite the fact that that is just over half the non-doms we had in 2007 and 8, you're still getting the same amount of income tax. Thing is, though, if we didn't lose anyone, assuming we didn't lose anyone by keeping the non-dom the way it was, and obviously the way the world works, obviously there's ways that would be a silly assumption, but let's just assume it was. Let's even assume we only lost half of what we lost. So we had, say, 100,000, no, it'd be more than that, 110,000 non-doms here. The tax intake on income tax alone would be 9.2 billion. And again, assuming the much more accurate figure of the £8 billion that we would lose over 4 years, that obviously just pays for itself. I cannot believe an expert on tax has actually put these terrible figures out and tried to actually claim that, despite the fact, as we will go through, we all know that the loss of the non-doms has cost us in tax revenue and, of course, GDP. He's trying to claim that actually these changes would make it work, despite the fact that, if reform are to be believed, they've been in contact with an awful lot of the wealthy people, and actually this is the policy they have come up with that apparently they're happy with. Yeah, I'm sorry, I trust reform a hell of a lot more than this terrible article. Because realistically what's happened here is Dan, as I keep saying, has been advising pretty much every major party on their tax policy. Absolutely everyone hates the tax system as it exists. It's overly complicated, it needs to be streamlined. Apparently Dan's been advocating that for some time, but it never happens. However, his only advice to Labour with the new scheme is just, make some tweaks to inheritance tax. Well, realistically, let's look at the actual results of this. Well, according to the Times, the abolition of the non-dom regime has led to the government losing hundreds of millions of pounds worth of property tax revenue, researchers claimed on Monday. A drop in the number of sales of homes worth 5 million or more in London between March 2024 and May this year cut stamp duty revenues by £401 million, according to research by Frank Knight, an estate agent. Don't get me wrong, it's hardly a massive revenue generator, but let's just make it very clear, these non-dom changes are reducing tax revenue at a time when we are supposed to believe it's actually increasing it, and reverting it back to the way it did work would lose us revenue. That is the narrative that Dan has been trying to push, and just absolutely every single article that comes out and every further estimation beyond the OBR tells a completely different story. Knight Frank made the claim on the basis that the number of prime property transactions has fallen below what would normally be expected over the 14-month period. It comes after data from the estate agent and LonRes, the property data provider, showed that sales of prime residential properties in London dropped by 40% on an annual basis in May alone. Now, could you put this all on the non-dom tax? No, probably not. But ultimately, this is just an entire story about the tax system as it exists. I don't see why returning it to when the tax system was better would be harmful. And once again, it has to be said, I think basing your attack on OBR statistics that the OBR themselves say are unreliable is not a particularly good move. Another report from today. Britain on track to lose a record 16,500 millionaires this year as tax increase and falling economic confidence drive wealthy residents abroad. Again, not just the non-dom change, but the whole tax base in general is atrocious. Again, Dan has been advising on this for years. The exodus is part of the historic wave of wealth migration, with multiple countries competing for talent and capital, according to the latest Henley Private Wealth Migration Report. It says a record 142,000 millionaires across the globe will relocate to new countries this year. The study, which analyses migration trends among people with liquid assets of more than $1 million, predicts that the UK will lose twice as many high net worth individuals as China and 10 times as many as Russia. Sorry, just to be clear, that's $1 million, not 740, which is £740,000. Dr. Jörg Steffen, the chief executive of Henley & Partners, the migration advisory firm that commissioned the report, said that Britain had emerged as a cautionary tale in this new era of wealth migration. He estimated that the heading for the exit this year would collectively hold £66 billion in investable assets. We are losing £66 billion worth of assets from the United Kingdom because we have ridiculous morons who have been making even more ridiculous tax regimes that has basically made anyone who is successful hate it here. Clearly there is a massive need for a massive change in thinking on this. And I'm not being funny. If your argument back is, well, hang on, the OBR that's wrong all the time says no, yeah, guess who I'm trusting? But regardless of me looking into all this and effectively proving Dan's complete and utter trash analysis wrong, it was still bleated toward reform because that's all journalists know how to do. And Farage just dismissed the claims that his non-dom policy will cost $34 billion, despite saying he's not clever enough to respond to criticisms from tax experts. I mean, if you listen to the clip, it's a bit of a joke, obviously. They also rejected the criticism of his Robin Hood policy as completely off-the-wall nonsense after warnings it would deter skilled migrants without attracting many billionaires. Which, again, as I've gone through, the skilled migrant thing might be a genuine issue. However, not being funny, they are not exactly the asset-rich class everyone seems to think they are. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, attacked the policy as a massive tax cut for foreign billionaires. Again, it's just normal and how it worked through every other Labour government we've had, by the way. It is technically a tax cut, but it's also costing the Treasury, so make up your own mind on that. And warned that public services would have to be cut to pay for it, as Labour seized on Farage's most detailed policy announcement since taking the lead in the polls. Farage insisted that tens of thousands of people will come to the United Kingdom as a result of the policy, which would allow non-doms to pay a one-off fee of $250,000 to avoid ever paying UK tax and overseas earning. How is that still being reported? This just shows how much they only bothered to read Dan Neidle's report rather than the actual policy itself. That's how bad journalism is these days. This is why this nonsense has spread. And I'm not being funny. Saw a lot of right-wingers on Twitter retweeting this absolute nonsense, trash, useless analysis too. So, you know, I've got my eye on you. Unbelievable. It also goes into how the proceeds would be sent directly to the bank accounts of the full-time Brits on the lowest earnings. Which, again, that's just red meat. This is obviously just a way to bring the non-dom regime back to how it worked before it made all these problems, while not annoying everyone and giving people like Gary Stevenson and Grace Blakely an excuse to get the Greens up in the polls. Yes, it's basically bribery for votes. Welcome to universal suffrage. At least this is actually going to full-time workers who are actually trying to be somewhat productive. Okay, they're already overpaid, technically, and minimum wages are already way too high. Get all that, but you're not going to win votes by saying we're going to cut minimum wage, are you? So unfortunately you basically have to inflate it to the point where the minimum wage becomes pointless, which will take some time, but I'm expecting all this to take time. Bear in mind, with Maggie Thatcher, it took about till her third term till we got proper Thatcherism, and everyone was happy apart from the Scots. Anyway, there's an ongoing back and forth between Dan and Zia on Twitter. I'm not too bothered about that. I think I want to largely finish off the video now, and I want to do that by, well, pointing out yet again that there is just a Farage derangement syndrome on the right, where basically a lot of right-wingers want to try and denigrate reform as quickly as possible without any real thought into, well, policy announcements and things like that, because frankly a lot of people on Twitter, all they're interested in is the immigration policy, and I'm interested in the immigration policy, and yes, they did say they'd have it out by now and they don't, but hey, working in business, sometimes deadlines aren't reached. Anyway, I'm talking about things like this. Adam Wren. Dan is a beast. No, he isn't. He is part of the reason we have a terrible tax regime. I intuitively knew it was stupid, and it's nice to see the numbers crunched. Well, I crunched the numbers. They were horrendous numbers, to the point where he was using numbers that are admittedly highly unreliable, and yet The knee-jerk instinct from an awful lot of these people, because Adam Wren isn't the only one, but it's certainly the one I'm going to focus on, is to effectively say, oh, Reform don't know what they're doing, they obviously don't know what they're doing, business is completely different to the public sector, and therefore I'm just going to assume everything they do is terrible. That's the mindset. What are you doing? Using a Labour activist with terrible numbers that you are literally just agreeing with because it's confirmation bias. That's all you've done here. And that's pretty bad for someone who's supposed to be on Twitter effectively number crunching and saying, here's what's happening, here's a narrative that I'm largely making myself, and from what I can tell, and going into all these numbers makes the most sense. Everything said by this leftist is stupid. And I wouldn't even call Dan a leftist, but I certainly would say that he is for economic orthodoxy, which is another absolutely crazy thing. An awful lot of these people are not for economic orthodoxy as it exists, and yet will assume that any change to the orthodoxy is just stupid in and by itself, which I don't think is a particularly helpful way to go forward if ultimately we're trying to fight economic orthodoxy, but there we go. Stephen Loftus is another one who I think's a bit more of a Tory activist, but is again just taking this Dan Neidle evidence at face value when, as we've gone through, okay, there's some decent points in there, but his main thrust of his argument, the 34 billion number, is total nonsense. So Reform had the opportunity to be a serious right-wing party with serious policies and instead pump out poorly thought-out populist slop for headlines. This up there with Sturgeon's free bikes policy. Well, it isn't, is it? Because at the end of the day, Loftus is a critic of the way the non-dom status has been changed to this FIG regime and says that actually the way it worked was perfectly fair. Reform are just returning to it. That's all they're doing. They're just changing the way that the payment is done for people to actually take advantage of it. But because Reform are doing it, it has to be bad, and we have to trust quite clear Labour activists using terrible numbers that Steve is usually very good at pointing out. But because there's Farage derangement syndrome going on in an awful lot of people on the right who, I don't know, want to be taken seriously or something like that, I guess, they're effectively doing everything they can to keep the Tories relevant. Why? I guess because Robert Jenrick says some good things on Twitter. Other people with a knee-jerk reaction against Reform, Carl Benjamin for example, crazy how delivering for working people doesn't mean creating conditions of opportunity, it just means siphoning money from the rich to give handouts from the state, even for Thatcherite Reform Party. Yeah, once again, it has to be pointed out that the overall point of this is to bring back the non-doms, which do create opportunity, and who do create businesses, and who do create jobs. They are wealth creators. They are known as that for some reason. They are being referred to that for a very specific reason. Bribing voters who don't understand how they are going to be affected by this, in my mind, is just honest politics for once. Don't like it, but once again, think about to Thatcher's reign. Took us 6 years before we got proper Thatcherism involved. I'm not being funny. Well, minimum wage workers will absolutely appreciate £600 extra in March. Won't be March, it'll be May. It's hardly going to stop people trying to get a promotion, which typically end up with, I don't know, a 10 to 20% increase in their income. Do you really think that's going to be stopped by them getting £600 extra a year rather than the 2,000 to 4,000 they'd get from a promotion? I don't think so. But actually looking at good criticism now, I mean, it took time for him to get to it, to be fair, but Max Tempers, once again, my shining star of the online right for the man who actually can criticise things on a consistent level and in favour of his core values. Reform want to speed run wage compression even more. That store security guard getting 70% median income salary doing nothing because of the sky-high minimum wage. Reform will give him £1,000 more. Again, that's reliant on this actually working and getting non-doms in. And again, we're missing the point of somehow Reform have actually got the conditions in place where effectively minimum wage workers, you know, typically people who would be following Grace Blakeley, say, now have incentive to actually want non-doms back. They already do, it's third order effect that they don't really understand, because who can be bothered to learn about politics? Instead, it's just giving them a direct incentive to actually want non-doms back. I don't think that's a terrible way to go. However, wage compression is actually a serious issue, and the fact that minimum wage is now, nearly £12? Something like £23,000 a year or something minimum wages. My first grad scheme, when I got it back in 2019, I was on £21,000 a year. Okay, sure, you had hyperinflation since then and everything, but it's pretty ridiculous that at first minimum wage was brought in at about 40% of median wage. Before that, by the way, the economy worked fine, but now we've got to a point where the minimum wage is about 75%. Again, I am completely with max here. However, I think when the main point of this policy is to get non-doms back, that's what we should be focusing more on than necessarily the minimum wage problem, because frankly I would imagine Reform have larger economic policies than this that will hopefully increase productivity and make the minimum wage basically pointless in, I don't know, 5 years, which is the only way you're going to get rid of minimum wage, by the way, which I had a conversation with Max Tempers on Twitter publicly about it, and he understood it, but I completely get the immediate problem. I'd also point out that your average store security guard probably isn't a British national, so he can't actually benefit from this either. Effectively what this was more was a bribe to Scotland, Wales and the North East, which is where most of the people benefiting from this British nationals on minimum wage actually are. So he goes on to say, Reform will make the gap between the middle and lowest earners shrink even faster than Labour and the Tories. What a pitch. I don't think that's true. Labour and Tories ruined productivity, which is largely why we have the gap in the first place. They're obviously right to want to undo the awful Tory and Labour non-dom reforms, but this is pretty infuriating, lol. Again, the reason I'm completely fine with Max Tempers' criticisms for this is because, one, they're accurate, and two, he's actually getting on board with the fact that the non-dom reform needs to go back to the way it was. Again, it's a bit knee-jerky. I expect that from Twitter to some extent, but it's not like Max Tempers is taking an OBR report that itself says the numbers are whack seriously anyway. And as I say, I had a conversation on Twitter with him. He's very much on the side of the minimum wage needs to go. Totally understand that. Unfortunately, it's not happening. Ultimately, we live in an age of the populists, and, well, frankly, you're obviously going to get populist slop while populist slop is popular. But you need the real economic upturning policies that you can get, effectively by bribing the people that don't feel like they are going to actually reap any sort of benefit from it. I mean, realistically, this policy, the worst case scenario, nothing happens to me. The best case scenario, my wages go up because productivity increases. I don't really care that minimum wage workers are getting an extra £600 from a scheme that in the long run is going to up the Treasury intake anyway, most likely anyway. I don't really care that they are bribing people to get people to vote for them. Every party does this. Reform are being direct with it. If anything, I find it more honest. And anyone who understands their tax regimes know the changes to the non-dom, absolutely abysmal. All done, by the way, just because Rishi Sunak's wife was a bit greedy. That's the only reason the Tories knee-jerked on it. And it made a tax regime that already scared a few of them off. Labour's changes has made it even worse. And now, okay, you're getting slightly more from non-dom taxes that you didn't get before, but you're losing income tax, you're losing capital gains, you're losing VAT as well, you're losing stamp duty. Add it all up together, yeah, we've probably actually made a net fiscal loss. Probably part of the reason we're having to borrow over 130 billion a month at this point. And I mean, I was listening to quite a few people talk about this yesterday on GB News and things like that, and even relatively Thatcherite people were saying, well, this all makes sense. I really like that the non-dom's coming back, but on the other hand, redistribution feels a bit weird. But effectively, they were dog whistling, saying, oh, well, as long as it gets them to vote for them, who cares? It's not costing anyone anything because it's just direct taxation. I mean, another issue with this, by the way, that no one brings up, it's actually hard to say if that can actually work because the tax system is so ridiculous. It's very hard to actually ring-fence things and direct money that goes into a big pot to actually take all that money and make sure it actually gets to where it needs to go. But on the other hand, if it just means throwing all that money into a pot and then redistributing the exact same amount of money out as this benefit, then whatever. I can see it working that way. But on the other hand, if that can actually be used as another big mallet to hit the civil service and tax code saying this is a ridiculous way to run the country, fine with me too. Anyway, back to the topic. You actually look at a lot of the mainstream right-wingers who are on GB News, write for The Spectator, are in think tanks. Largely, they are somewhat for this because they understand the change to the non-dom were terrible and need to revert. Basically the Max Tempers position on the whole thing. And Matthew Lynn of The Spectator, who has a long career in writing about finance and tax, writes this: it's already clear that the Labour-Tory consensus on driving out the non-doms has been a disaster for the British economy, while the Starmer government's determination to put up taxes on the rich has led to an exodus of wealth and talent. Reformers recognise how damaging that has become, worked out that the UK needs to attract wealth, and recognise that entrepreneurs and business owners who have left the UK need to be brought back. Indeed, extending the tax break to returning British nationals may well prove the most significant part of the package. Yeah, we need wealth here. Name me a poor tax haven. Oh, Ireland's not doing pretty well in places. Yeah, fine. You can find exceptions to these rules, but realistically, you don't particularly get poor tax havens. Reform could afford to go even further with their plan. The £250,000 flat fee may well need to come down if the UK is to compete with similar deals available in Italy, Greece, and the zero taxes levied at Dubai and the Caribbean. A much lower annual threshold may well generate more overall revenue, and it should extend the offer to foreign entrepreneurs, with far lower rates of capital gains tax to start-up who wants to move from the high tax base in Paris, Stockholm or Madrid to the far more lightly taxed London, Cambridge and Bristol. And I want to say Zahir Yusuf retweeted this article and said, oh, this is good criticism. That implies to me that, yeah, this is an initial bribe to get reform in place and they'll move to this more sensible policy in the future. Read between the lines. The important point, however, is this. As the non-doms and the wealthy flee the Chancellor Reeve's increasingly punitive tax regime, she will now have to defend her decision against a very clear alternative. And if they're using that 34 billion line, that's going to fall flat when it turns out that the OBR even said the number's terrible. The disaster of taxing success becomes clear. That will become a harder and harder, and reform's alternative will look more attractive. I think that's true. And I think that's what makes this overall good policy. Again, instinctively I'm against redistribution. But they're being honest and saying this is just a bribe to get us in power. Fine, every party does that. So to conclude, the main basis of Dan's attack on reform here that have been quoted to them and the mainstream media are trying to build as the main narrative come from absolutely exceptionally poor numbers from the OBR that the OBR themselves call highly uncertain. The other parts of his criticism, the smaller, yet maybe there will be an issue with highly skilled migrants coming over not wanting to be punitively taxed. Okay, fine, maybe that's something to look into. However, if we're just going to an old tax regime anyway, don't see why that would be an issue. It was never brought up as an issue before. Nobody was saying the non-dom changes will increase skilled workers here, so I don't know why going back would change that. And the other point, you are relying on reform being in for 10 years for this to even work. Fine with me, just keep voting reform. There have been retorts to Dan, of course, many people pointing out he is a Labour activist and has been working closely with Labour for nigh on 35 years. Okay, certainly on the more blue Labour side, but is still advised for terrible tax regimes, not just in Britain as a whole, by the way, but Scotland too. He advised the SNP. And ultimately, I keep getting the reply of people saying, oh, but even if he says, okay, that's an overestimation, even if it's 20 times lower, it still won't work because you still have to make up, what, £1.2 billion that you're going to lose? Yeah, you actually look at the numbers from further estimates that aren't the OBR and are more reliable, they're actually looking at, oh, we're actually looking at a likely scenario where we actually lose money from the Treasury. According to hard data, as I say, from Oxford Economics, who actually has clients who are talking about this sort of thing, which is data that I am treating as much more reliable than the OBR. And anyway, the knee-jerking against reform also has to stop. There's criticisms here. I went through them. I even accepted some of them. People call me a Farage fanboy all they want. To some extent, obviously, it's true. I am human after all, and as far as I can see, is the only reason for optimism in the UK. But ultimately, especially, I saw some people as well saying, oh, but this will increase immigration. As if the problem with immigration was foreign billionaires. Are you kidding me? That's a line Gary Stevenson says all the time, and every writer calls him a moron for it. All of a sudden you agree with him. What are you talking about? Come on. We have to keep an eye on these low IQ takes. We have to keep an eye on these emotionally driven morons from leading the charge forward when it comes to our arguments, because at the end of the day, it makes you look like fools. MAGA is splitting apart for this very reason, by the way, and frankly, I hope the smarter people win on that front. Luckily, we've managed to do it before really we've had a large-scale success with reform in terms of actually winning a general election. We won local elections, things seem to be going fine on that front. You've got every piece of the establishment trying to humiliate them in whatever way they can. The most recent one, by the way, is finding an interview, a video interview from one of the reform councillors who clearly has not had media training and isn't very good on camera, just answering questions honestly, like, oh, do you know about the relationship with this company? No, I don't, I'm afraid. I genuinely don't. Okay, fine, yeah, not a great answer, doesn't inspire confidence. At the same time, not every councillor would be, and I never expected them to be. But with that sort of experience, you can end up being better and being more prepared for future interviews. I've never seen councillors under this much scrutiny before, but reform when all of a sudden, entire establishment, from Robert Jenrick to The Guardian, all trying to bash on reform like this. If anything, it's showing me that maybe reform are the way forward for actually getting rid of all the orthodoxy that we hate, but plenty of people do not want him to be the man to win. Why? God knows. But if you're criticising him for stupid reasons such as OBR numbers, yeah, you are getting heavily criticised by me. There's fair criticisms of him. I accept them plenty of times. But I swear to God, if I hear something like they need a leadership election in reform, like another time, I'm going to scream. We have now had over a year of Farage being leader, along with the team he's largely built. You know, they got 34% on Ipsos recently. Even the recent YouGov poll still shows them in the lead relatively comfortably. Who is your alternative? Get real. Twitter isn't the real world. YouTube isn't the real world. It is effectively a place for loose women to be broadcast, but with topics that you actually care about. I prefer my statistics. I prefer to look into this policy. I prefer not to dismiss businessmen who have made successful businesses putting forward policy and understand a system that has effectively made it hard for them to get in the position they're in but still manage to do it. It's a classic John Peterson rule. Just assume the person you're talking to has something interesting or new to say. I went through Dan's criticism and found that there was some to take away and think, yeah, maybe that is a problem, and found a lot more that was to say, wow, I can't believe you published that. I just want to make it very clear, as much as I clearly am a reform activist and on Farage's side, I will still try and give you as much value-free analysis as I can. Obviously from a perspective of electoral politics at this point, because ultimately that's the only thing that matters now. Winning the damn elections. Anyway, that's enough time of me on the soapbox there, so with that I will leave it there. Tonight we have Tosh News over on the Worcester Club. Thursday, we have Subnautica. Saturday, Laughing at the Guardian with some women, so do come along to all them. Videos out as and when I can make them. If you enjoy my channel, do subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment. They really help the channel to grow and get me up in the algorithm. If you have a few quid to spare, do become a member, leave super chats, super thanks. Really good ways to help out the channel, and I appreciate everyone who donates money. Right, with that is everything I had for you for today. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.